All right, guys. So your homework tonight is where you are right now. We are going to go through the remainder of our notes on westward expansion in the Gilded Age, time period six. Talking about a couple topics today. First, here, cattle and railroads, and then probably with a little bit more detail, challenges of life out on those Great Plains and the problems and the response from the farmers in political organization, some of which we already talked about when we talked about politics of the Gilded Age. Okay. As I said, we're going to get going here with a couple simple topics: cattle and railroads. Um, we have this idea of the American cowboy. It is huge in American imagery. We're talking about the open range cattle farming. Okay. And for a short time it was absolutely a major industry for Mexicans and Texans, and then the great American cowboy and the cattle drives from uh, Kansas and Missouri, driving the cattle from Texas and former Mexican territory, I should say, to Kansas and Missouri and to the trailheads. Um, but we actually see kind of the decline of the American cowboy during this time, and we talked about kind of the closing of the frontier earlier in class. Some of that is because of some of the innovations of the Gilded Age. We have the advent of barbed wire fencing, which uh, decapitates the cowboy industry in many regards. That the cattle can be contained not by cowboys but by fencing. Railroads take a more prominent role in shipping the cattle than do the cowboys on these drives. So we see here a map where you have the old school major cattle routes, and then, of course, the completion of the railroads, which we'll talk about, which serve as, in the future, the more prominent means of transporting cattle. And so life out west is changing. Certainly, railroads have played a huge factor, as we've been talking about in heck to the buildup of the Civil War. Recall with the Kansas Nebraska Act, westward expansion, manifest destiny prior to the Civil War, during the Civil War, here after the Civil War. Um, there's about 30,000 miles of railroads. We're talking 1865. And 35 years later, by 1900, there's about 200,000 miles. More miles of rail than in all of Europe, 7 times the railroad growth over that 35-year period. The first transcontinental railroad, right, is constructed by two companies. First, the Union Pacific, which builds westward from Omaha, Nebraska, out to California, and the Central Pacific, which is built eastward from California. We had talked previously about the wetting of the rails in Promontory, Utah. We had talked previously about the labor forces, um, the new immigrant labor forces at play here. The Irish are the primary labor for the construction of the railroads in the east, and we had also talked about, right, the Chinese labor force um, out west. And we had talked about with respect to corruption, going back to Ulysses S. Grant. Um, we had talked about the corruption and the big business that was because of these huge land grants that the railroad companies got from the government. Um, I had suggested to you some of the corruption on display through the kind of historical fiction we see in Hell on Wheels. But it's actually really interesting when you look at the rail maps. Okay, you got one in front of you that kind of looks straight, but over a course of a given tract of land, you see the rails are kind of zigging and zagging. The railroad companies are getting paid by the mile. There's tremendous exploitation. Um, but nonetheless, the importance of the railroads cannot be understated. when we're talking all the way from 1850 into the early 1900s. I've got a video linked on this slide. It is about 10 minutes long, but it emphasized the importance of connecting the nation over the railroads. I'd like you to check it out now. Pause me, watch this video, then come back to me, please. So, the next topics we want to get into are what is life like out west on the Great Plains for the Americans working there? Um, the answer is that it's not easy, and it results in a lot of the political organization, as I said, that we've talked about before. The fact of the matter is that life is very challenging for those who move west. Um, just a matter of physical geography. The land is very dry. It's difficult to farm. A lot of folks who try this life give up and move back east. A lot of the farmers that go there are new at farming. They tend to try to pick one crop, typically wheat or corn. And once that happens, they're tied to the land, much like the South had been tied to cotton. And so they are reliant upon good growing conditions, which can fluctuate and through no control of their own can put them in danger of going bankrupt. Right? Um, they are reliant upon high prices and getting paid a good price for their crop, and high prices are going to collapse in the 1880s and in the 1890s, and the economic devastation is real. Deflated crop prices hurt the farmers. They are trying to pay for their land at what they now feel is an unfair rate. They have to sell more of their crop to make the same amount of money, and so they're over farming and exhausting their land and their soil. Meanwhile, there's incredibly high prices on the farm equipment, on the supplies like fertilizers. Um, the interest rates on loans controlled by the bankers are very high. Remember that we're really talking politically about radically different populations, right? Between the elite, the bankers, those who have the money in the capital, and the workforce here, whether we're talking the urban workforce, or here, of course, the Western farmers or the Southern farmers. And we talked about the incredible power, right, of the railroad industry. And railroads are charging whatever they want for the farmers. And so they're paying exorbitant prices to ship their goods back east. Um, and all the while, they are essentially just being squeezed. Um, they make up about 50% of the American population at this time, but they are unorganized. And when you are unorganized, that is a political liability. Hey, it goes right back to why, right, the progressives are fighting for unionization at this time. So um, we can see here one example of what's happening to the farmers, how they're getting squeezed, right? It's a matter of simple supply and demand, but it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy of their going bankrupt. We're growing as uh, and by the way, a lot of the immigrants that are moving out west tend to be German that are becoming farmers in Midwestern states, Nebraska, Kansas, and so on. And they're, as I said, kind of tying themselves into a single crop, often corn, often wheat. And no matter how much they produce, they're still going bankrupt because the prices are going down, right? Because supply is going up. But they feel a need to continue with their overproduction just to meet their overhead. And so they need to organize. All right. Just like, as I said earlier, labor needs to organize in the cities, the farmers need to organize. They're dealing with low prices. As especially in the 1880s and the 1890s, the prices plummet, as we saw in the previous graph. Um, it's a burden on them. It's flat out, right? a reduction in their income. But they still have to pay the same overhead. They're not getting relief from the banks if they have loans out on their farm equipment or supplies. Uh, that loan remains static. Okay. Now we're going to get to this concept of bimetallism that we talked about earlier that would increase the money supply and allow these farmers to get out of their debt. Clearly, kind of that's where we're headed. Okay. But again, they're also being squeezed by those transportation costs that we talked about. The railways, which are, as I said, incredibly powerful, are able to charge whatever they want. The mortgages, okay, remain high. And a lot of farmers are losing their land or under direct threat of losing their land. So, as I said, their logical solution is to grow more crop to make up the income difference. But as we see, that overproduction causes prices to deflate even further. We saw that on the chart. All of these problems combined, and the farmers clearly see the need to organize. So they first instill a movement called the Grange, which becomes the Farmers Alliance, which becomes the Populist Party that we talked about in class last time, which advocates a series of political reforms, especially through economic policy like bimetallism that will address the farmers' problems. Okay. The Grange, one of those first organizations, intends to simply organize the farmers really kind of through social and educational means. It's almost like a fraternal organization. And it serves then by uh, developing some cohesion among the farming population to provide them with some political power intended to improve their lives. These farmers are called the Grangers. Okay. The populist party will emerge from this movement. Okay. And they demand a lot of concessions from big business, okay, perhaps government as well, for the farmers. This is the same. We do see a little bit of a nexus, right? Or at least parallel paths between the populist movement and the progressive movement, in that they each seek to improve the lives of their people. They just kind of have a different definition of who their people are. But in both cases, they seek concessions from big business, the wealthy elite, the bankers, and they seek concessions from and or policy from the government. For the farmers, the biggest policy is what we talked about in our last class again, bimetallism, right? Using gold and silver to back currency to increase the money supply. When we get to our presidential chart, which I hope you're still building, okay, William Jennings Bryan is one of the presidential candidates that advocates for the use of bimetallism. Okay, so this is a huge rallying cry among this emerging populist movement representing the Western farmers. The federal government does come in and provide some aid uh, for the farmers. Notably, I think for many of you, um, looking at colleges, okay, the Morrill Act of 1862, and then again reestablished in 1890, gives federal land to states to finance agricultural colleges. These are known as the land grant colleges. There's improved technology that helps farmers. The new steel plow, we talked about the Bessemer process and how much that helps just about every industry out there, okay, is invented. The plow that is invented by John Deere. The Bessemer process was, of course, Henry Bessemer. There is invention of the mechanical reaper. There is, as we said earlier, barbed wire. But the land grant colleges provided by the Morrill Act, and here we're primarily focusing on that of 1890, establishes government funded colleges that are intended to improve the lives of the farmers. Notably, NC State is one such land grant college. But if you take a look at the map, an incredible amount of universities that you're probably familiar with, right? Kansas State, Iowa State, University of Minnesota, Oklahoma State, Texas A&M, New Mexico State University, Colorado State University, University of Wyoming, University of Nevada, Utah State. These are all land grant colleges established by the Morrill Act. Back to the Grangers, right? The Grangers form the Farmers Alliance. Uh, they are all working in cahoots. That might be kind of a poor way of putting it, because the Populist Party, I was about to say they're working in cahoots with the Populist Party, but the Populist Party isn't really, it's a movement, right? So the Grangers naturally become a part of this populist movement because they're advocating for policy prescriptions that make sense to them. The Grangers form the Farmers Alliance, which is, hand in glove, if you will, with this same movement. Okay, the Farmers Alliance sends people across the country to kind of again help organize farmers, to discuss issues that affect farmers, to educate them on those issues, to talk about loans and how to service loans. Farmers are in incredible debt. To talk about perhaps how to combat the banks on these loans through organizations. Same thing with the railroads, and so on and so forth. And so the Grangers, the Farmers Alliance, the Populist Party, this notion of bimetallism, all of these factors are working together. So whereas we really focused in our last class more on the progressive movement, our focus today, as we're talking about American society in this era of westward expansion, is, well, who are we politically out west among quote unquote the common people, the farmers? And the answer to that question lies in understanding this populist movement that emerges from the inclusion of the Grangers and the Farmers Alliance. They fight the railroad companies because they think, and they're right, that the railroad company practices are unfair and corrupt. They want the federal government to control them. And so several states pass laws that regulate the rates that railroads can charge farmers. These are known as the Granger laws, okay, that kind of cap, uh, which I don't know, it would seem like common sense, what a railroad company can charge farmers, because, hey, farmers are feeding the country, right? We are in this era of emerging progressivism. This would be a progressive era reform just intended to benefit the common man of the populist movement. That, the progressive era reform here is, hey, government can establish a policy to improve the lives of the farmers, right? To utilize government to affect net positive change for the common people. Now, the railroad companies sue. They think this is unfair. They think that, this notion of an unbridled, unharnessed capitalist market should remain, and that, hey, they control the railways. They should be able to charge what they want. But in this case, Munn v. Illinois of 1877, the Supreme Court rules that states can, in fact, regulate the railroads. However, the Supreme Court later rules against the states in subsequent cases. And this significantly weakens the state's ability to regulate interstate commerce. Um, the argument here is essentially that a state can't regulate this industry that crosses the borders and the commerce of many states. That's interstate commerce, okay? And so the Granger laws, as it were, are incredibly weakened. Many of the Granger laws are full on eliminated. In response to this, here's progressive era reforms back at play, right? the Interstate Commerce Act is passed by Congress, because now the federal government, we will remember, we can go back to, Gibbons v. Ogden and the steamboat case, right? The federal government, not the states, does have the right and the responsibility to regulate interstate commerce. And so the Congress creates the Interstate Commerce Clause, or Interstate Commerce Commission, excuse me, which says that the federal government can regulate railroad fares and practices. Okay. Now, it doesn't end up making a whole significant amount of difference, because the federal government, even though they go through this step, is still at this point, until we're going to turn that century, until we're going to really hit that progressive era that we're coming upon, is still kind of somewhat laissez faire. But the writing is on the wall that it's the first attempt by Washington, D.C. to really kind of put a check and regulate this big time business that has taken place in America. And in addition to, steel and oil and Wall Street, railroads are that big time business that we're talking about. Okay. So we have kind of successfully, I think, broken down in our last class what is happening with this progressive era. And we compared and contrasted a little bit between the progressives and the populists. And when we looked at westward expansion today, we got a chance to get a little bit deeper into the populist movement as a result of what challenges farmers were facing, under this general heading, right, of American westward expansion during the Gilded Age. Now we're essentially kind of creeping up here on the end of time period 6. And so there's a whole host of questions that you should be able to answer. What do we mean by the Gilded Age? What does that name imply? I think we've exhausted that question, and you should be able to address it. Who are the robber barons, as Howard Zinn calls them? What are the major companies? Who are the major business tycoons? If you're not into Zinn or a textbook, watch The Men Who Built America. Okay. But what is Zinn's criticism of them? It does harken back to this general notion of what we mean by the Gilded Age. Okay. How does life change for America, Americans, the American consumer, as a result of the Gilded Age? Right? We're talking about the significant achievements with respect to innovations and inventions during this time, the birth of a consumerism, really, the birth of an advertising industry, these incredible advents in technology, be it everything from the elevator to the Bessemer process to the light bulb, but transportation as well. Bullet point 4 here. Okay, what is the most notable and significant achievement of this day when we talk about transportation? When we talk about other industries, we want to understand what happens to America's population during this time. Who are these new immigrants, and how are they different on the West Coast than the East Coast? What kind of backlash do these people face? How is life different for the old and the new immigrants? Okay, that talks to the assimilation, the Americanization movement, the nativist movement. We're still talking about racism. We're still talking about prejudice in America. I'm not even talking right now on these questions about what life is like for Black Americans, but we talked a lot about that. We talked about the Wilmington Massacre, right? We talked about the end of Reconstruction, which we tackled as a separate topic, but really plays a lot into what's happening to the lower classes in America of both races, but now also of different ethnicities. Okay. What's life like for this new batch of urban Americans? And understanding as we're witnessing this incredible economic growth, what's happening to the the underclass, right? The exploitation of the working class. And perhaps how that's different between the farmers and the labor force. Okay. Speaking of the farmers, as we talked about today, right? What's happening to them out west? What challenges are they facing? How are their challenges, the white farmer in the south and the west, how are their challenges different, but also similar to the challenges being faced during the Gilded Age by the urban workforce? We talked about the difficulties for Black Americans at this time. Well, what about Native Americans? Okay. What challenges are they facing? What's happening to what tribes? How does this notion of assimilation and Americanization in urban America with respect to European immigrants compare to the assimilation and the Americanization movement affecting Native Americans? Okay. This is all, everything I've been rattling on here as I've been on this slide tells the story or asks the questions of you to tell the story of America during the Gilded Age. And I certainly hope that you can do that. That's all we got for today. Make sure you're going to answer these questions on the Ed puzzle, and I'll talk to you soon.